Why did the French choose to surrender to the Germans rather than resist to the end? Let's remember that at the beginning of World War II, the French army was one of the strongest, numbering more than 2 million people and protected from Germany by the Maginot Line of 750 kilometers. But it didn't help them. It should be clarified right away that a small part of the French were ready to continue fighting after June 22, 1940, when the Second Armistice of Compiègne was signed, the terms of which more closely resembled a capitulation with reservations, and the Germans sought revenge on the French for the defeat in 1918. However, in order not to throw too heavy a stone into the garden of fighting France, it is worth noting that in the eyes of contemporaries in 1940 to 1942, Charles de Gaulle was often perceived as the leader of a bunch of marginals under the patronage of the British, and later, Americans and Bolsheviks. There is no one in France who can vouch for me, and I have not enjoyed any fame in the country. There is no trust or justification for my activities abroad. These words of Charles de Gaulle about himself in 1940 give a clear idea of his position. Who was Charles de Gaulle? From a legal point of view, it is even difficult to dispute this. In 1940, he was a relatively young and capable military commander. But on June 17, 1940, he left France and went to London. Thus, he found himself in a position comparable to the Polish emigrant government. But even worse, because on the one hand, de Gaulle had yet to become the leader of the Free France, and on the other, there were more serious figures in France who stood on the side of the collaborationist Vichy government. At that time, there were generals and marshals in France since the First World War, ministers, deputies, officials, and industrialists, most of whom supported the capitulatory truce. Although many of these people will change shoes in a few years, it will happen later. At that time, the official government, led by Marshal Philippe Pétain, a famous World War I hero and prime minister, demanded that the citizens stop resisting. Work, family, homeland was the propaganda poster of the French collaborators. However, it is worth noting that Pétain de Gaulle was eventually saved from execution. Thus, the French formed a very specific view of the events of the Second World War. De Gaulle became the symbol of the sword of France, and Pétain became the shield of France. However, in my opinion, this explanation is not entirely accurate. Against the background of these events, it is worth remembering that the demands of the government, which remained in charge, were superimposed on the military defeat of the French, which became a real shock to them and to the whole world. While the elite could not and did not want to continue the struggle, de Gaulle, while in London, tried to convince the French not to accept defeat. In Bordeaux, the Pétain government sentenced him to death in absentia, calling for an end to the hopeless resistance of the remaining garrisons on the Maginot Line. At that time, German troops were already in Paris. It is worth noting that the German forces did not occupy the entire territory of France. On June 22, 1940, the French still had a huge colonial empire, where not everyone was ready to admit defeat. However, the French overseas territories were quite fragmented, and the continuation of resistance, in any case, already threw those who were determined to be irreconcilable to the periphery of the struggle. The British offered the French their conditions for a united state, but many immediately saw in this the desire of the old enemy to subjugate France. The history of conflicts between England and France has many episodes over the centuries. It is noteworthy that even in the period 1940 to 1942, the forces of Vichy France and Great Britain managed to enter into a military confrontation, albeit on a limited scale. The French leadership theoretically had the opportunity to continue resisting the aggressor, but only in a subordinate position in relation to the British allies. A significant factor in the decision to surrender was the fact that the main territory of the French metropolis was already under the control of German troops. If the fighting continued, the main impact would fall on French territory and the population, while Britain, protected by the Strait, remained relatively inaccessible to direct invasion. Analyzing the motives of the French elite who agreed to the Armistice of Compiègne in June 1940, several key aspects can be identified. Many representatives of the political and military leadership of France considered the proposed conditions relatively lenient. It is important to emphasize the legal status of the document. It was a truce, not a final peace treaty. Despite Mussolini's demands for tougher conditions, the French side managed to maintain its own government, navy, colonial possessions, and a significant part of the territory, albeit under the supervision of the German occupation authorities. Marshal Pétain, who headed the French government, was absolutely convinced of the correctness of his decision to end the senseless war. His logic was based on the following reasoning. If the largest European army suffered a crushing defeat in just 6 weeks from the German armed forces, which the French managed to defeat in 1918, then how could Great Britain, capable of fielding only a few combat-ready divisions, hope for successful German resistance? In Pétain's eyes, Germany seemed to be the absolute master of the continent, with a reliable ally in Italy, friendly relations with Spain, and the guaranteed neutrality of the Soviet Union. Yes, exactly 1 year later, coincidentally on June 22, 1940 and June 22, 1941, everything will change quite seriously, and even then, not everyone will notice it right away. After all, at first, British and American analysts were convinced that the USSR would share the fate of France, be quickly defeated by the Wehrmacht, and so on. In June 1940, however, it turned out that only the British remained at war with the Third Reich. And of course, the British would not have liberated French territory. They would have kept their island and their colonies. Therefore, it was very easy for the Vichy to declare all the resistors, that's right, British agents. They're sitting there in their London, muddying the waters, and we're suffering for them. Such a position of the French elite gave little chance of any large-scale popular resistance. Moreover, the German occupation of France was relatively mild. However, it should be noted that over time, the occupation of France will become tougher. Later, the Germans would occupy the territories that had previously been at the disposal of the Vichy. The indemnity that Germany exacted from France was enormous, and the prisoners of war were not released for a long time. Despite this, it is still impossible to compare the actions of the German authorities in France with what happened in the Soviet territories. However, in the light of these events, the question arises, should the French partisans really have fought for de Gaulle, who left for London and for the British colonies, at the risk of losing everything, as happened with many real resistance members? That's how it was perceived by many contemporaries. In addition, other reasons were superimposed on this context. An important factor was the severe legacy of the First World War, which caused the growth of pacifism in society, aggravated by the strange war, as well as the general systemic crisis of the French state. The most conservative and affluent part of society feared the possible return of the new commune. As Dubachov noted in his work, the French High Command was not psychologically ready to wage a new war. The exaggeration of Hitler's military potential contributed to the desire to end the war as quickly as possible, preserving the nation and the state with minimal losses. For the French elite, guerrilla warfare would pose a significant risk to the nation's polarization. So as a result of the Second World War, this happened in Europe, in particular in France and Italy. Who was supposed to be the asset of the illegal resistance? It is unlikely that the old generals and bankers would have sought to join the partisan ranks. Most of them felt great under the Vichy regime, without experiencing any particular inconvenience. As already mentioned, few of those who eventually joined the resistance were able to escape the consequences. However, the elite chose the old order, continuing to defend their power and property, while the middle class sought to maintain calm and end the conflict. Only a few enthusiasts continued to fight, both in France and abroad. Among them were veterans of the Spanish Civil War, including Russian emigrants and later Soviet prisoners of war, who became active participants in the French resistance. Friends, this is how the video turned out. And what do you think about this? Write an answer in the comments, and do not forget to subscribe to the channel and put likes.